Hi, and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today, we're joined by Mark Geragos, who was the lead defense counsel in Scott Peterson's trial of the murder of his wife, Laci Peterson. We're going to discuss the case and some general issues within the criminal justice system. So let's get to it, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us on Criminal Justice Natters. How are you?
I'm excellent and happy to join you because I love the name, Criminal Justice Natters. I love the old Spiro Agnew expression, nattering nabob of negativism, and that you combine it with my passion, which is criminal justice, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for joining us. I've got a few questions for you, and we've got a couple of questions from social media fans of the show as well. So if it's okay, when you first got the Peterson case, what was your initial thoughts when that first came to your attention?
Well, I was a commentator on one of the cable news networks at the time, and I remember thinking when the bodies of Laci and Connor washed up on shore, I think I had commented there's guys in state prison for a lot less, on a lot less evidence. I always thought that was a pretty compelling piece of evidence in terms of probable cause to go get him, and I expected he would have been arrested soon. You know, that's one of the reasons the family reached out to me, is because they were adamant that he was innocent, and that comment kind of agitated them, understandably so. And we started talking. By the time I had finished speaking with Scott's mother, who's now passed, I was convinced as well that I needed to meet with him and talk to him, and I did. And I was convinced from day one that he not only didn't do this, but didn't have the wherewithal, the capabilities to do it. I mean, there's certain clients, I've been doing this for almost 40 years. There are certain clients who it does not require a great deal of imagination to picture them doing what they're accused of doing. This is, I don't think anybody knows or has lived the evidence like I have, other than maybe Scott, but this case just never made any sense to me once you got and took a look at the evidence.
And what was it about the evidence that really jumped out at you to say that Scott Peterson was innocent?
Well, there's never, usually when you have somebody who's accused of a violent crime, there are certain markers in their past, whether it's through childhood or whether it's once they start entering into relationships, things of that matter. There was nothing in his past. In fact, it was completely the opposite. In fact, I'll never forget, we put on in the penalty phase a nun who knew him, and I talked to so many people who knew him and just said it was incomprehensible that he could have done what he was accused of doing.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the overall process, bearing in mind, and I wouldn't mind touching a little bit later on the sort of media coverage before the trial and during the trial. If you took the whole process as a whole, do you think Scott had a fair trial?
Oh, no, not. I complained bitterly during the process, in real time, afterwards. In the last, 8 months or a year, the California Supreme Court reversed the penalty phase conviction based on the argument that we made at the time. We made the argument at the time that the judge was unfairly dismissing people who had a opposition to the death penalty. And he shouldn't have done that. And I was objecting in real time, because what that did was people who are pro-death penalty generally tend to also correlate with people who are pro-prosecution. Mm-hmm. And by eliminating, and you weren't eliminating those people, but you were eliminating people who had real problems with the death penalty. Now, anybody who's breathing should have some qualms with the death penalty. You have to look no further, starting with the Innocence Project and the number of people that have left death row that have been found to be factually innocent. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, it's come out that the DNA profile of somebody who was not the defendant was found in a case where they put to death, killed the defendant almost 4 years ago here in America. That's disturbing. And the state really shouldn't be in the business of killing people. It doesn't have, in California at least, the system is irretrievably broken. Right now, the current governor has put a moratorium on the death penalty. But coming full circle to your question, did he get a fair trial? Well, number one, they reversed it because they said the penalty phase was infirm, broken, because of that quality of the. I always thought that based on that alone, the conviction should be overturned. They didn't go that far, but they did issue what's called an order to show cause as to one of the jurors who was obviously, I think, had an agenda and came in there and she wanted to convict him, and apparently was untruthful on her juror questionnaire. And that's what's being litigated right now as we talk.
And that's still going on, because that from the documentary that I watched, that's pretty much the end of that particular show, and that's still going on.
The documentary, I haven't watched it recently, but I assume the documentary leaves off where they fully brief things. What I have just kind of gone through with you is post-documentary. Okay.
And if so what could potentially happen to that juror that's being litigated right now? And then what
the Supreme Court has done is they've issued an order to show cause, meaning telling the trial court judge who's now hearing it. It's not the judge who tried the case, because he's passed on as well. But a new judge was assigned, and she is going to hear evidence and hear briefing on whether they should throw out the conviction, not just the penalty of death or life, which is really kind of silly because there's a moratorium on the death penalty, and only a prosecutor would think that it's a good use of money and resources in the post-pandemic era to try somebody again for the death penalty when there's a moratorium. That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the documentary, did it have any impact on how you sort of did your job? Were you aware of it, or did you just put it to the back of your mind?
Documentary really wasn't done in real time. It was done after the fact. I knew at the time, in real time, that we had an uphill battle. I mean, I had always thought that I was trying this case to get a hung jury. I just didn't think that a not guilty was in the cards, just because the jury was not sequestered until they went into deliberations. There was such a prejudgment rate of guilt that I had always suspected, and it turned out to be true, that there would be jurors who lied their way to get onto the jury in order to convict him, and that it appears, at least now, that was prescient.
Yeah. And in terms of trying to get on to the jury, this is just your opinion, but was it an attractive case because it's high profile? And I know a couple of jurors have written a book sort of afterwards and things like that. Do you think that might have influenced their types of decisions? Or
I practiced law, or have mostly practiced during most of my career in California, and we do seem to have jurors who like to write books, or after the case is over, or sell record albums, or do documentaries. California. When I first started practicing, the jury pool was primarily defense contractor employees. Lockheed and TRW and things of that nature. The last civil jury trial I did before the pandemic, when we asked everybody, because it was a Hollywood-related case, I asked everybody who was in the industry to please raise their hand, and I would say fully 80% of the jury raised their hand had some connection to Hollywood.
Yeah. Okay. Um, in terms of the media coverage that Scott's case received, it seemed to be consistent and very sort of in-your-face coverage. As you said, the talking heads almost every night. The lady's name escapes me.
Nancy Gray.
That's right. Yeah. And
Well, I used
just
to say that there was, and I don't know, this is 15 years ago, and I probably can't say it now, but I used to affectionately or not so affectionately refer to them as the coterie or phalanx of bleach blonde former federal prosecutors. And they didn't let the facts, they didn't let the evidence, they didn't let any presumption or legal get in their way. They had a narrative that they were going to tell.
And I think that's a really interesting term, that they have a narrative that they're going to sort of tell to everyone. I mean, I guess these types of shows and segments have really high viewing figures, and Nancy Grace is very popular or well known. But the authority that she spoke to or spoke with without actually seeing the evidence, I found quite shocking. And
well, there's, it's interesting. I assume you're coming from London?
Yeah, it's the south of England. Yeah, about 100 miles away.
One of the things that I have written about and lectured on, American criminal justice, with the advent of cable news in the last 25 years, because remember, 25 years ago, you basically had one cable news outlet. Fox News was just starting. MSNBC was just starting with their. But with Fox, you had, I think, the tabloidization, as I call it, of these supersized cases, where I used to joke that CNN used to have me on speedy dial every time a pretty white woman disappeared or her husband was under suspicion. I mean, those became kind of the staple of cable news, which I think started in England. And whether you want to do a deep dive on that or not. But what the English have, which you probably are familiar with, is the Contempt of Court Act.
Yeah.
We don't have that and in America. And that is, I think, our Achilles heel in these supersized cases. You can't do the tabloidization without having some kind of a way to clamp down on the trial and the coverage of it at the time of the trial. So the next best thing, I always think, is sequestration of the jury, meaning you take them out of society basically during the trial itself so that they presumably don't get influenced by extraneous factors and things of that nature. I don't think, and I'm not in the weeds in England anymore, but I don't think you've got that so much as you put a clamp down on the coverage at certain points in the procedure, which makes some sense. And people go, well, what about the First Amendment here in America? And I always say, guess what? Go 5 more down. What about the Sixth Amendment right to fair trial? What about the Sixth Amendment right to counsel?
Absolutely. And I think the sort of reporting restrictions we have over here does absolutely limit what you would have seen in that documentary. People
Which I think is why, to some degree, England is fascinated by kind of these supersized trials of ours, because you don't have that phenomena to some degree.
No, absolutely not. And would it be realistic to take the jury out of society for those 5, 6, 7 months that the case is running on for? Does that happen?
There's been 2 cases that I can think of in the last couple of years. One was Casey Anthony down in Florida, and the other was a case involving Aaron Hernandez that was in Massachusetts. Both of those cases, my understanding is the jurors were sequestered. Both of those cases, the defendants were found not guilty. Yeah, is there a correlation? I think so. I think if people are not intimidated by what's going on around them and are laser focused on the evidence, I think you get a result, or at least the process is allowed to work out the way it is designed to. There was a famous case in America called Shepard versus Maxwell, and one of the most legendary criminal defense lawyers made his name on that, which was F. Lee Bailey. In that case, the U.S. Supreme Court talked about the pernicious kind of influence of the media on criminal trials. Well, that case looks quaint by comparison now. That was decided in the 50s, and by comparison now, whether you want to call it pernicious or pervasive influence of the media is exponentially greater.
Yeah, and in terms of Scott's case, it just seemed to be constant media coverage, and what really surprised me was the sort of publication of the alibi or where he said he was going or where he was on that Christmas Eve. Is that the norm?
Well, we have going back to Shepard v. Maxwell, originally that was designed, gag orders, to help or presumably, theoretically, to help the defense.
Yeah.
What has happened is, kind of like with grand juries, it's been turned on its head, and it actually hurts the defense, because what happens now is that the prosecution and law enforcement leaks. They've got a symbiotic relationship with the media. Yeah. So they leak everything. Everything gets leaked. We've got our man. This is the alibi. We've debunked it, blah, 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 blah. And then they want to put a gag order on the defense. So the defense has no way of catching up or responding. And so is it the norm? Yes. Should it be the norm? No.
No. So you weren't allowed to.
I think we're going to see sometime in the next couple of years, you'll see the U.S. Supreme Court have to revisit that case.
Yeah. So were you gagged then for making any comments on?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes. And that was during a time when the Kobe Bryant case, the Michael Jackson case, which I was also involved in, and Scott Peterson, and the gag orders across those three cases, it was almost as if the judges, even though they were all state court judges and in two different states, were building on one another. In fact, the judge in Santa Barbara on Michael Jackson's case, I thought, had the most creative solution. He had what's called a safe harbor, where if you thought there was misinformation that had been leaked out there, that you could go to the judge and you could propose something, and Judge Melville would either agree to kind of bless it or release it, so that you could at least combat what I thought was a really unfair kind of advantage that the prosecution has. Because with what we call the shield law here, the reporter can't be normally forced, with certain exceptions, to divulge who their source is. No. And so what ends up happening is law enforcement knows if they leak something to a reporter that they've got the protection of the reporter, not kind of snitching them out.
Yeah. And in terms of this media coverage as well, what really surprised me was the constant play on Scott's sort of emotional setting and his emotional well-being and how he carried himself. And I thought to myself, well, and I think it was raised in the documentary, there's no set way to deal with grief.
I always used to say, I'm unaware of any playbook on how to grieve in a situation like that. And plus, he had all other kinds of factors working on him as well. He obviously knew that he was in an affair. He knew that the minute that became public, that all bets were off. People were going to stop looking for her. He held out hope, I think, all along, that she was alive and that he could find her, and then he could settle all that. I mean, there were so many misnomers and urban myths, so to speak, about that case. And I used to jokingly say that no matter how many times I could debunk that with somebody, if it was a Caucasian professional female, I would say, well, that didn't happen. She'd go, what about this? And I'd say, well, that didn't happen. We debunked that. And you go through the litany of things that were urban myths, and always at the end was the default, well, I don't care. I had an ex just like him, and I could see that he would have done.
Yeah.
So, at a certain point, it's just in the ether, and what can you do?
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the sort of investigation by the police, do you think the police narrowed in too early on Scott to the exclusion of other potential suspects?
Yeah.
Is it
part of what I think was most effective at the trial was the fact that most of the theories that the police have, we were able to debunk. whether it was a financial motivation or whether it was he was in love with Amber, which, even she conceded he'd never said anything of the sort. And whether it was that he didn't want to be a father, which was just patently untrue. So, yes, one of the things that's most nettlesome about that case was that the prosecution was sitting on a tape from a prison with a prisoner who was talking to I believe it was his brother. And one of the correctional officers, who was a lieutenant, so he was fairly high ranking, had brought to the attention of the Modesto PD that he had intercepted a call where they were talking about the burglary across the street. Now, at the time, that was one of the original theories, that maybe that Laci had confronted the burglars across the street and they panicked and either kidnapped her or killed her, or both. Police went very public saying, no, when they did the investigation, that burglary had actually happened on the 26th of December, day after Christmas. Well, that was nonsense. That was one helpful thing that you saw in the documentary, because by Christmas Day, that street, which is a very small street, not very wide, was absolutely mobbed with media because it had become a national story. This beautiful young lady who's pregnant and just goes missing on Christmas Eve. I mean, it captured the imagination.
Yeah. And how were you able to challenge that sort of narrative that the burglary took place on the 26th, or was it just buried by the police saying?
It was buried by the police until the day the jury came back and convicted. They did not turn over the tape until that day, which is mind-boggling to me. Yeah. How I could sit there for almost a year through jury selection, through the preliminary hearing, through countless motions and hearings, and then the trial itself, and then they just sat on that and waited.
And should they, by law, have disclosed that to you?
Absolutely. It's what's called exculpatory evidence, and the Supreme Court has made it quite clear that they've got an absolute duty to do that.
Yeah, same rules as over here. And did the prosecution say that was sat on through error, or did they hold their hands up and say,
they're a moving target on that? So it'll be interesting to see where they finally land. Let's just say I used to say at the time, as I was trying that case, they're turning over discovery that should have been turned over before we tried the case. And that was extremely frustrating in real time as well.
Yeah. And in terms of this sort of real time, sort of the decisions you had to make, did the constant sort of this media coverage of Scott's location and his movements on that day, is there any thought that could have given the real culprit an ideal place to dispose of the body?
I always thought if you got 5 months, because remember, we're talking about Christmas Eve, December 24th, and then you're talking some 5 months later. In fact, you can probably look it up. Sometime around today would have been the 18th anniversary, I think. Somebody would have had the opportunity to do that if they were so inclined. What better place to set him up than there, if that's the case? And by the way, I don't want to get ghoulish about it, but there are indications that that Connor, and at that point the fetus, was handled outside of the womb. So there's stranger things have happened, as I'll just say, and that always irksome to me, because it was one of the more compelling reasons to shine a light on Scott, but at the same time, it also was one of the kind of Achilles heels of the prosecution. It cut both ways.
Yeah, this is exactly what my partner said when we were going through it, and she said that it's just an ideal opportunity that if you were sat on Laci's body, that he's there, he was there on that particular day.
Exactly, and there were some other, without getting into all of it because I don't want to divulge anything, but there's other indications, I think, that are consistent with the fact that the bodies were not there at the time, and that they clearly were moved sometime later.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Just a couple more questions.
Right.
What did you?
I've got a heart out, unfortunately, and although I could talk to you forever, Ed, I love the format of this show, but I've got a heart out here shortly.
Okay, I'll make them quick. I'll move on to our viewer questions. Michael Lean asks, has the potential maliciousness of the police and prosecutor-friendly courts rendered the US criminal justice system unreliable?
Well, yes. I think that one of the reasons you've seen the advent of criminal reform movements and Black Lives Matter and other kinds of movements that have come about is because the system had swung so far to law enforcement and giving and impunity, not the least of which because of a judicially created doctrine we have here in the U.S. called qualified immunity, which basically renders any outrageous act by the police immune. So that's a great question. Yes, there are some of us who are cynical enough to say that.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is from Lauren Yaffe, and she asks, when the sort of approach changed and the prosecution said Scott murdered Laci the night before the 23rd, because obviously you had shown that it was impossible for her to do on the 24th, what impact did that have on the trial, this sort of shift in narrative?
I'll never get over the fact that the prosecutor got back up after I kind of walked through the evidence to show where they were absolutely wrong. It could not have happened the night before, and that they had ignored their own forensic witness, who, on cross-examination, admitted to me that they had ignored the signature of her logging into the computer on the morning of the 24th. Then they basically said, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, after that, really 8 months later, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the whole theory. But, this case was a hung jury until the judge started removing jurors during deliberations. And that's a subject for after the hearings, and I'll come back and talk to you about that.
That would be brilliant. I appreciate that, Mark. I know you're pressed for time. Thank you very much. You've been great. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Well, thanks, Mark, for such an interesting chat and being so open and candid about the case. I'm sure our viewers took a lot from it and perhaps even learned something new. I want to thank you for your time. Please make sure you check out Mark's podcast as well, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. It's extremely interesting. I listened to an episode over the weekend and thought it was great. As ever, I'd like to thank our supporters whose donations to the show constantly keep us going and get us to improve the platforms we use. So I'd like to thank Joe Doherty, Donna Jenkins, Lucy Green, Claire Malone, Ian Robbins, Elise Goff, Michael Saw, Pat Ryan, and Wolf Ryan. I would like to thank you very, very much. If you want to get your name on the credit, please check out the Ko-fi link in the comments. Until next time, farewell.